My foster parents needed someone to teach their son what pain felt like, since he was born without the ability to feel it. They picked me from the group home to be his live-in demonstration subject. Then I found videos of all the other foster kids they'd used before me. I was 13 when the Carters picked me out like a tool from a hardware store. They needed me for their son Mason, who couldn't feel pain, born with some rare condition that made him completely numb to physical sensation. Sounds like a superpower until you realize pain exists for a reason. Mason would touch hot stoves, jump off roofs, punch walls until his knuckles split. He had no warning system, no way to know when to stop. That's where I came in. The first week seemed normal. Nice house, good food, my own room. Then Mrs. Carter sat me down with this sweet smile. "We need to discuss Mason's condition and your role in helping him understand consequences." I thought she meant talking to him, maybe being a good influence. I was wrong. "When Mason does something dangerous, we need to show him what would happen," she explained. "You'll be his teacher." It started small. Mason wanted to know what a paper cut felt like. His mom made one on my finger while he watched. "See how she flinches? That's your body saying stop." But Mason didn't want to stop. He was fascinated by this thing he'd never experienced. Every day brought new lessons. Hot water, ice, pinches, nothing that left marks. They were careful about that. The worst part was Mason's genuine confusion. "Why does she cry?" he'd ask his parents. "It's just sensation, right?" They'd already gone through 2 foster kids before me. Found my file at the bottom of the pile. The kid nobody wanted. Perfect for their needs. School became my sanctuary. Turns out trauma makes you real good at focusing on anything else. I threw myself into every subject, every club. Teachers started noticing. Mrs. Rodriguez pulled me aside after English class. "You're gifted," she said. "Have you thought about advanced placement?" I wanted those AP classes more than anything, but I knew the Carters would find a way to use it. Make me teach Mason about academic pressure or some twisted thing. So I played dumb. "Nah, I'm good where I am." The system escalated when Mason turned 16 and wanted to drive. "How will I know if I'm hurt in an accident?" he asked at dinner. Mr. Carter looked at me. "Tomorrow we'll do a demonstration." That night I lay awake planning. They wanted me to experience a minor fender bender impact, show Mason what whiplash felt like, but I was done being their crash test dummy. The next morning, I had a plan. "Mason," I said, "want to know what fear feels like instead?" His eyes lit up. The Carters exchanged worried looks. "Fear is what really keeps people safe," I continued. "Not pain, fear of consequences." I spent that whole day teaching Mason about consequences through words, not wounds. Showed him videos of accidents, had him talk to a paralyzed veteran at the park. For the first time, Mason started understanding danger without anyone getting hurt. The Carters hated it, but Mason was hooked on this new concept. He started asking questions they couldn't answer. Why did they need me to suffer? Couldn't we just use medical books, videos, actual education? Mrs. Carter cornered me that night. "You're confusing him. He needs practical demonstrations." Or, I said, finding courage I didn't know existed, "he needs parents who don't torture kids." She grabbed my wrist. "You want to go back to the group home? Fine, but remember what happened to you there." I thought about those nights, the fear, the helplessness. Then I looked her in the eye. Still better than this. But I didn't get sent back, because Mason had started recording our lessons on his phone. He thought they were educational. Didn't realize he'd been documenting everything. I found the videos by accident when he asked me to fix his phone. Hundreds of clips, 3 years of previous foster kids, all of it labeled with clinical precision. Sarah demonstrates burn response. Marcus shows impact bruising. My hands shook as I opened his laptop. More files, foster care documents, payment records. The Carters were getting money for taking special needs cases, triple the normal rate because of Mason's condition. They'd built a business out of breaking kids. I copied everything to a flash drive, but I knew going to authorities meant foster care roulette again. New house, new horrors. Unless I played this smart, that's when I decided. If they wanted to use me, I'd use them right back. I started planning my next move carefully. The flash drive stayed hidden in the lining of my old backpack, but I needed more than just evidence. I needed Mason on my side completely. The next morning, I found him in the garage working on his bike. His hands were covered in grease, and there was a fresh cut on his palm he hadn't even noticed. I grabbed a first aid kit and cleaned the wound while he watched, fascinated as always. This time, though, I tried something different. I explained how the body heals itself, how pain is just information, not something to chase or demonstrate on others. Mason listened intently, then asked the question I'd been waiting for. He wanted to know why his parents never explained things this way, why they always needed someone else to show him. I chose my words carefully. I told him that sometimes parents make mistakes, even when they think they're helping. I showed him articles about his condition, real medical information that explained everything without anyone getting hurt. Over the next few days, I became Mason's unofficial teacher. We studied anatomy, watched documentaries, read medical journals. He absorbed it all with an intensity that surprised me. For someone who couldn't feel physical pain, he was remarkably sensitive to emotional nuance. Mrs. Carter noticed the change immediately. She started hovering during our study sessions, making pointed comments about staying on track with Mason's practical education. But Mason was already questioning their methods. One afternoon, he asked his mother directly why they couldn't just use medical textbooks instead of hurting me. She fumbled for an answer, mentioning something about real-world application. Mason didn't buy it. That's when the Carters shifted tactics. They started limiting my time with Mason, scheduling his days so full that we barely crossed paths. They enrolled him in extra activities, anything to keep us apart. But Mason was persistent. He'd sneak into my room at night with questions, not about pain anymore, but about the foster system, about how I ended up with them, about the other kids who'd lived here before. I walked a careful line, answering honestly without revealing everything I knew. I needed him to reach his own conclusions. If I pushed too hard, he might tell his parents, and then I'd lose any advantage I had. The breakthrough came when Mason found one of his old videos on his phone. It showed a previous foster kid, a boy named Marcus, demonstrating what a sprained ankle felt like. Mason watched it with a new perspective, and I saw the moment it clicked for him. He looked at me with horror in his eyes. For the first time, he understood that what his parents had been doing wasn't education. It was something else entirely. That night, dinner was tense. Mason kept staring at his parents, and they noticed. Mr. Carter tried to lighten the mood with jokes, but Mason wasn't laughing. Finally, Mrs. Carter asked what was wrong. Mason set down his fork and asked them directly about Marcus. Where was he now? Why did he leave? His parents exchanged glances, and gave vague answers about him aging out of the system. But Mason had done his research. He knew Marcus had been 13 when he lived with them, too young to age out. He pressed for real answers, and I watched the Carters squirm. They tried redirecting, asking if I'd been filling his head with stories. Mason defended me, saying I taught him more about his condition in 2 weeks than they had in 16 years. The accusation hung heavy in the air. After dinner, Mrs. Carter cornered me in the hallway. Her sweet facade was completely gone. She warned me that I was replaceable, that there were plenty of other foster kids who'd be grateful for a nice home. I met her gaze steadily, and reminded her that Mason was getting older, asking more questions. How long before he figured out everything on his own? How long before he realized the monthly checks they received were the real reason they kept taking in foster kids? She slapped me. Not hard enough to leave a mark. She was still careful about that, but enough to make her point. I didn't flinch. I'd been through worse in the group homes. What neither of us knew was that Mason had followed us. He saw the slap, saw his mother's true face. He didn't say anything, just turned turned and walked back to his room, but I knew everything had changed. The next few days were a careful dance. The Carters pretended everything was normal, but I could see the strain. They watched me constantly, checked my room when they thought I wasn't looking. They were searching for the flash drive, though they didn't know exactly what I had. Mason, meanwhile, had become my silent ally. He started documenting everything himself, not for education, but for evidence. He took photos of the locks they'd installed on my door, recorded their conversations when they thought he wasn't listening. One evening, Mr. Carter announced they were taking a family trip, just the three of them. They'd arranged for me to stay with another foster family for a week. The message was clear. They were regrouping, planning their next move without me around, but Mason refused to go. He said he had too much schoolwork, that he couldn't afford to miss a week. His parents tried to insist, but Mason held firm. For someone who couldn't feel physical pain, he'd learned to inflict the emotional kind with surgical precision. The night before his parents left, Mason came to my room. He'd found more videos, older ones from before I arrived. 3 different foster kids over 5 years, all documented, all carefully labeled, all gone now. I'm really curious about this whole setup with Mason's condition being used as some kind of excuse for this twisted arrangement. The way they picked her out, like a tool from a hardware store, makes me wonder if they had a specific checklist they were. He asked me what I planned to do. I told him the truth, that I had evidence but nowhere to go with it. The system had already failed me once. I wasn't eager to trust it again. Mason surprised me then. He said he'd been researching emancipation laws. At 16, he could petition the court to live independently. He had a trust fund from his grandparents, money his parents couldn't touch. He could get his own place and I could stay with him until I figured things out. It was a wild plan, but it was better than anything I had. We spent the rest of the night planning, researching, preparing. Mason was methodical, making lists and backup plans. For someone who'd been sheltered his whole life, he adapted quickly to rebellion. His parents left the next morning, still believing they had everything under control. They'd installed cameras before they left, thinking they were being clever. But Mason knew where they all were, had watched his father set them up. We had a week to prepare everything. Mason contacted a lawyer using his trust fund information. I organized all the evidence, made multiple copies, prepared to tell our story. We worked like a team, each covering for the other. The Carters called every day, checking in. Mason played the perfect son, assuring them everything was fine. I stayed quiet in the background, playing my role as the troublesome foster kid they'd soon be rid of. But we both knew the countdown had started. When they returned, everything would change. The only question was whether we'd be ready in time. On the 4th day, Mason found something that changed everything. Hidden in his father's study was a file on me. Not just the foster care paperwork, but notes they'd made. Plans for escalating the demonstrations. They'd been building up to something bigger, something that would have left permanent damage. Mason's hands shook as he showed me the papers. For once, I was glad he couldn't feel physical pain, because the emotional kind was written all over his face. His parents had been planning to hurt me in ways that would have destroyed any chance I had at a normal life. That's when I realized we couldn't wait for them to come back. We had to act now, while they were gone, while we had the advantage. The flash drive wasn't enough anymore. We needed to ensure they could never do this to another kid again. Mason made the decision that would change both our lives. He called his parents and told them he'd found their files, all of them. He gave them a choice: sign emancipation papers and let me go, or he'd make sure everyone knew what they'd been doing. The silence on the other end of the phone stretched for what felt like hours. Then his mother spoke, her voice cold and calculated. They'd be home in 3 hours. We discussed this as a family, but Mason and I both knew what that meant. They were coming back to clean up their mess, and we were the mess that needed cleaning. We had 3 hours to prepare for whatever came next. Mason and I sprang into action. He disconnected the security cameras while I gathered every piece of evidence we'd collected. The flash drive went into a sealed envelope along with printed screenshots of the worst videos. Mason wrote a letter explaining everything in his own handwriting, making it clear this was his decision. We drove to his lawyer's office first. Mason had called ahead, and the receptionist led us straight back. The lawyer, an older woman named Alexandra, listened as Mason laid out everything. Her expression grew more horrified with each detail. She made copies of our evidence and promised to file the emancipation papers immediately. Our next stop was the bank. Mason withdrew enough cash to last us several weeks. His hands trembled as he signed the withdrawal slip, but his resolve never wavered. The teller asked if everything was all right. Mason nodded and smiled, playing the part of a normal teenager perfectly. Back at the house, we packed essentials. I stuffed clothes into my old backpack while Mason filled a duffel bag. We worked in silence, both knowing the Carters would arrive soon. Every car engine outside made us freeze. Mason's phone rang constantly, his parents trying different tactics. First anger, then bargaining, then threats. He let it go to voicemail each time. The messages grew increasingly desperate. Mrs. Carter's voice cracked as she promised they'd change, that they'd never hurt anyone again. We were loading the car when headlights swept across the driveway. The Carters had arrived 2 hours early. Mason grabbed my hand and squeezed. We'd prepared for this, but fear still coursed through me. Mr. Carter got out first, his face a mask of forced calm. Mrs. Carter followed, her movements sharp and agitated. They approached slowly, like they were dealing with spooked animals. Mason stepped forward, putting himself between me and his parents. The gesture was small but significant. For the first time in his life, he was protecting someone else from pain. His father started talking about misunderstandings, about how we could work this out as a family. His mother added promises about therapy, about getting proper help for Mason's condition. Their words sounded rehearsed, desperate. Mason pulled out his phone and showed them the lawyer's business card. He explained that the emancipation papers were already filed, that copies of their videos were in safe hands. If they tried to stop us, everything would be released. Mrs. Carter's composure cracked. She lunged forward, trying to grab Mason's phone. He stepped back and she stumbled. Mr. Carter caught her arm, holding her back. The look he gave Mason was pure venom. They tried everything: emotional manipulation, threats about Mason's future, reminders of all they'd done for him. Mason stood firm. He'd spent 16 years unable to feel physical pain, but he understood emotional manipulation when he saw it. The standoff lasted an hour. Finally, Mr. Carter made a calculated decision. He agreed to sign the papers, to let us go, but there were conditions. We had to leave immediately. No contact with authorities, no spreading their business around town. Mason agreed, but I saw the look in his eyes. He was playing along, buying us time. We got in the car and drove away, watching the Carters shrink in the rearview mirror. We spent that night in a motel 2 towns over. Mason paid cash, and we registered under false names. Neither of us slept. We sat on opposite beds, planning our next moves. Mason would follow through with the emancipation. I would stay with him until I turned 18, then figure out my own path. The next morning brought new challenges. Mrs. Carter had called Mason's bank, trying to freeze his trust fund, but the account was in his name alone, protected by his grandparents' foresight. She'd also called the lawyer, threatening legal action. Alexandra wasn't intimidated. We couldn't go back to the house, but we needed more of our things. Mason had a friend from school, Nicholas, whose older brother worked at a moving company. We arranged to have them pack up our rooms while the Carters were at work. The motel became our temporary base. Mason set up his laptop and continued his online classes. I studied for my GED, determined to catch up on the education I'd missed. We fell into a routine, 2 damaged kids trying to build something normal, but the Carters weren't done. They started a campaign to discredit us. Mrs. Carter called Mason's school, spinning stories about about his mental state. Mr. Carter reached out to family friends, painting me as a manipulative influence. They were careful, though, never saying anything that could be proven false. Mason's phone became a weapon they used against us. Constant calls, texts, voicemails. His extended family reached out, having heard the Carters' version of events. Some believed his parents, others sensed something was off. Mason fielded each call with patience, sticking to facts without revealing the worst details. We realized we needed a more permanent solution. The motel was draining Mason's funds, and we couldn't hide forever. Alexandra suggested we look for an apartment, something modest that wouldn't raise questions. Mason was old enough to sign a lease with his emancipation pending. Apartment hunting while trying to stay under the radar proved challenging. Landlords wanted references, proof of income, stability. We had none of those things. Mason's trust fund helped, but people were suspicious of a 16-year-old with money. Finally, we found a small place above a restaurant. The owner, an older man named Vic, didn't ask too many questions. He'd been young once, he said, and understood needing a fresh start. The apartment was tiny but clean. It felt like a palace compared to the uncertainty we'd been living in. Moving day arrived, and with it, another confrontation. The Carters had been watching, waiting. They showed up at the apartment as we were carrying boxes inside. This time, they brought reinforcements. Mason's aunt and uncle, his father's business partner. They formed a wall of concerned adults. The intervention was carefully orchestrated. Each person took turns expressing worry about Mason's decisions. They painted a picture of a confused boy led astray by a troubled foster child. Mason listened to each speech without interrupting. When they finished, Mason calmly pulled out a tablet. He'd created a presentation, complete with timestamps and evidence. He showed them video after video of what his parents had done, not just to me, but to the others before me. The room grew silent as the reality sank in. His aunt was the first to break. She turned to Mrs. Carter with disgust in her eyes. The business partner excused himself, muttering about needing to reconsider their professional relationship. One by one, the Carters' allies abandoned them. Mr. Carter tried damage control, claiming the videos were taken out of context, but Mason had been thorough. Mason's parents called him every day during their trip to check in. That's interesting considering they supposedly trusted their camera system so much. Makes me wonder if they were actually more worried about Mason catching on to their plans than they let. He showed them the payment records, the foster care documents, the pattern of children cycling through their home. The evidence was overwhelming. The confrontation ended with the Carters completely isolated. Their family support network crumbled. Mason's aunt offered to help us get settled. Ashamed she hadn't seen the truth sooner, we politely declined. Trust was a luxury we couldn't afford yet. That night, the Carters made their biggest mistake. Desperate and cornered, they tried to break into our apartment. Vic heard the commotion and called the police. The Carters were caught trying to jimmy the lock, tools in hand. The police report was straightforward. Attempted breaking and entering. The Carters spent the night in jail, their carefully maintained reputation in ruins. The local newspaper picked up the story. Not the full truth, just enough to make people wonder. Mason used the incident to push his emancipation through faster. No judge would send him back to parents with a pending criminal charge. The hearing was scheduled for the following week. We prepared meticulously, gathering character references and documentation. The Carters hired an expensive lawyer. They tried to paint the break-in as a misunderstanding, concerned parents trying to check on their son. But the security footage from Vic's restaurant told a different story. They'd come prepared, with tools and clear intent. During this time, I discovered something that changed my perspective. While organizing papers, I found my original foster care file. The Carters hadn't just picked me randomly. They'd specifically requested a child with a troubled background, someone who wouldn't be believed if they spoke up. The realization hit hard. Every moment of kindness in that first week had been calculated. They'd studied me like a specimen, finding the perfect victim for their twisted system. The anger that flooded through me was different from before, colder, more focused. Mason noticed the change in me. He suggested we use this information strategically. If the Carters had done this with me, they'd done it with others. We started reaching out to previous foster children who'd lived with them. Finding them wasn't easy. The system protected privacy, and many had moved on with their lives. But Mason was persistent. He used social media, old school records, anything he could find. Slowly, we built a network of survivors. Sarah was the first to respond. She was in college now, studying pre-med. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd been with the Carters when she was 14, had endured 6 months of their lessons before aging out of their preferred victim profile. Sarah's story matched ours perfectly. The initial kindness, the gradual escalation, the careful documentation. She'd kept quiet for years, convinced no one would believe her. But she'd saved evidence too. Photos of bruises in places clothes would hide. Journal entries describing each demonstration. Next came Marcus, now working construction in a neighboring state. He'd been the youngest, only 11 when the Carters took him in. His story was the worst. The demonstrations had been more extreme, the psychological damage deeper. He'd spent years in therapy trying to process what happened. We arranged a video call with both of them. Seeing their faces, hearing their stories, strengthened our resolve. We weren't just fighting for ourselves anymore. We were fighting for all the children the Carters had hurt. The emancipation hearing approached. The Carters pulled every string they had left. They tried to get the hearing postponed, claiming they needed more time to prepare. The judge denied their request. They tried to bar me from attending, arguing I had no legal standing. Alexandra shut that down quickly. 2 days before the hearing, Mrs. Carter made one last attempt to reach Mason. She showed up at his school, waiting by his car. Mason texted me immediately, and I rushed over from the library where I'd been studying. I found them in the parking lot, Mrs. Carter crying while Mason stood with his arms crossed. She was begging him to come home, promising they'd get rid of me, promising they'd be a normal family. The desperation in her voice was painful to hear. Mason's response was measured. He told her that getting rid of me wouldn't fix what they'd done, that their version of family had never been normal. He offered her a chance to get help, to admit what they'd done and seek treatment. She refused, still clinging to her delusions of righteousness. Security arrived, alerted by concerned students. Mrs. Carter was escorted off campus with a warning not to return. Mason sat in his car afterward, shaking. For all his strength, she was still his mother. The emotional toll was evident. That evening, we received news that shook our plans. The Carters had filed a countersuit, claiming Mason was mentally incompetent due to his condition. They argued that his inability to feel pain made him incapable of understanding consequences, therefore incapable of making legal decisions. It was a clever move, twisting Mason's condition to their advantage. Alexandra was furious but not surprised. She'd seen parents use every possible tactic to maintain control. We had 48 hours to prepare a response. Mason threw himself into research. He found medical experts who specialized in his condition, gathered testimonies about his academic performance, his decision-making abilities. He was building a case that his physical condition had no bearing on his mental capacity. I focused on documenting our daily life. Videos of Mason managing finances, making responsible decisions, caring for himself independently. Evidence that he was more capable than most adults, let alone teenagers. The night before the hearing, neither of us could sleep. We sat in our tiny kitchen, going over everything one more time. Mason was confident but nervous. This hearing would determine everything. Freedom or a return to hell. As dawn broke, we dressed carefully. Mason in his best suit, me in borrowed professional clothes from Alexandra. We looked young but determined. Vic wished us luck as as we left, pressing a small charm into Mason's hand for good fortune. The courthouse was intimidating, all marble and authority. The Carters were already there with their legal team. They looked smaller somehow, their perfect facade cracked beyond repair. Mrs. Carter tried to catch Mason's eye. He looked straight ahead. Alexandra met us in the lobby with good news. Sarah and Marcus had provided written statements. 3 other former foster children had come forward after hearing about the case through social workers. The pattern was undeniable. We entered the courtroom together. Mason took his seat at the petitioner's table while I found a place in the gallery. The judge entered, an older woman with sharp eyes. She'd reviewed the case files, she announced. This would be a thorough hearing. The Carters' lawyer went first, painting a picture of concerned parents trying to save their son from a bad influence. He emphasized Mason's condition, suggesting someone who couldn't feel pain, couldn't understand the pain he was causing others. It was manipulative, but effective rhetoric. Alexandra's response was methodical. She presented Mason's academic records, his test scores, evaluations from teachers. She showed videos of him explaining his condition with medical accuracy that would impress doctors. She demonstrated his complete mental competence. Then came the evidence of abuse. Alexandra was careful, presenting facts without sensationalism. The videos Mason had found, the payment records, the pattern of foster children. She built a case that showed the Carters as calculating predators, not concerned parents. Mason was called to testify. He spoke clearly, explaining his journey from confusion to understanding. He described discovering what his parents had done, the moral awakening that followed. He was articulate, composed, everything the Carters' lawyer had claimed he couldn't be. The Carters' testimony was painful to watch. They clung to their narrative of helping special needs children understand the world. Even faced with their own videos, they insisted their methods were therapeutic. The judge's expression grew increasingly skeptical. During a recess, I overheard the Carters' lawyer advising them to consider a settlement, give up parental rights in exchange for dropping the criminal charges. Mr. Carter's face turned purple with rage. They'd come too far to give up now. The afternoon brought character witnesses, teachers who'd noticed my injuries but been told I was clumsy, social workers who'd checked on previous foster children but been fooled by the Carters' act. The pattern of deception became clear. The judge called for final arguments. The Carters' lawyer made one last attempt, invoking family values and parental rights. Alexandra countered with the rights of children to be free from abuse, the responsibility of the court to protect the vulnerable. As the hearing concluded, the judge announced she would deliver her decision within 72 hours. We left the courthouse exhausted but hopeful. The truth was out. Whatever happened next, the Carters could no longer hide behind their respectable facade. Those 3 days passed slowly. Mason continued his online classes. I studied for my GED. We maintained our routine, afraid to hope too much. Alexandra called with updates. The judge was being thorough, reviewing everything. On the 3rd morning, we returned to the courthouse. The gallery was fuller this time. Word had spread. Social workers, foster care advocates, even some reporters. The Carters looked haggard. Their confidence evaporated. The judge's decision was comprehensive. She granted Mason's emancipation, finding him fully capable of independent living. She praised his courage in coming forward. She noted the evidence of systematic abuse spanning years. The timing of that break-in attempt seems awfully convenient for Mason's case. Makes me wonder if the Carters really didn't think about the security cameras, or if desperation just made them that careless, right when everything was falling apart. But she went further. She recommended the Carters be investigated for criminal child abuse. She barred them from ever fostering again. She ordered them to pay restitution to their victims. The gavel came down with finality. The Carters left quickly, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Their lawyer muttered about appeals, but everyone knew it was over. They'd lost everything. Their reputation, their income scheme, their control over Mason. Outside the courthouse, Mason and I stood in the sunshine. Free. Truly free. Alexandra congratulated us, but warned the hard part was just beginning. Building a life after trauma took time and work. We returned to our little apartment above the restaurant. Vic had prepared a celebration dinner. As we ate, I realized something. For the first time since entering foster care, I felt safe. Not just physically safe, but emotionally secure. The next weeks brought adjustments. Mason dealt with guilt over destroying his family, even knowing they'd brought it on themselves. I struggled with nightmares, my body still expecting pain that wouldn't come. We supported each other through the difficult moments. The Carters tried one more manipulation. They sent Mason a letter through their lawyer, offering to pay for his college if he dropped everything. They still didn't understand. It had never been about money. It had been about freedom, dignity, the right to exist without being someone's experiment. Mason burned the letter in Vic's restaurant sink. We watched the paper curl and blacken, taking their last attempt at control with it. The smoke alarm went off and we laughed. Even our small rebellions had consequences, but they were our choices to make. The weeks after the hearing brought unexpected challenges. The Carters' lawyer filed appeal after appeal, each one more desperate than the last. Mason and I would find thick envelopes slipped under our door, filled with legal threats and emotional manipulation disguised as concern. We stopped reading them after the 3rd one. Mason's extended family started reaching out more frequently. His grandmother on his father's side called daily, leaving voicemails that alternated between tearful pleas and angry accusations. She'd raised Mr. Carter, couldn't believe her son capable of such things. Mason listened to each message once before deleting it, his face growing harder with each call. The financial pressure mounted quickly. Mason's trust fund covered our basic expenses, but the Carters had found ways to make our lives difficult. They'd contacted every landlord in town, spreading rumors about us being troublemakers. Vic stood firm, but other businesses started treating us differently. The grocery store clerk who'd always smiled at us now watched us suspiciously. The pharmacy made us wait longer for prescriptions. I focused on my GED preparation, while Mason threw himself into online college applications. He decided to study medicine, specifically pain management and rare neurological conditions. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. He wanted to help kids like himself, but through actual science, not twisted demonstrations. One morning, we woke to find our car vandalized. Someone had keyed long scratches down both sides and slashed one tire. No note, no message, but we knew. The Carters were getting desperate, resorting to petty intimidation. Mason filed a police report, adding it to our growing collection of documentation. Sarah called that afternoon with disturbing news. The Carters had reached out to her parents, trying to discredit her testimony. They'd painted her as a troubled teen who'd made up stories for attention. Her parents didn't believe it, but the call had shaken them. Sarah was considering getting a restraining order. Marcus faced similar harassment. His employer received anonymous calls suggesting he was unstable, dangerous around children. Fortunately, his boss knew him well enough to recognize the lies, but Marcus started documenting everything, preparing for escalation. The other foster kids who'd come forward reported similar tactics. The Carters were systematically trying to undermine everyone who'd spoken against them. They couldn't accept their loss, couldn't stop fighting even when the battle was over. Mason decided to take action. He compiled all the harassment documentation and sent it to Alexandra. She immediately filed additional motions with the court, seeking expanded protective orders. The judge who'd handled the emancipation case was not pleased to hear about the continued intimidation. 3 days later, the Carters were summoned back to court. This time, they faced contempt charges for violating the spirit of the court's orders. Mason and I attended, along with Sarah and 2 other former foster children who'd driven in to testify about the harassment. The hearing was brief but decisive. The judge issued comprehensive restraining orders, barring the Carters from any contact with their former foster children. She warned them that further violations would result in jail time. Mr. Carter's face flushed dark red, but he stayed silent. Mrs. Carter wept quietly, still playing the victim. After the hearing, we gathered at a nearby coffee shop. Sarah, Marcus, and the others shared their stories more fully. We discovered patterns we'd missed before. The Carters had targeted specific types of children, those with traumatic backgrounds, limited family support, histories that made them less credible witnesses. One girl, Amy, revealed that she'd tried to report the Carters when she was 15. The social worker hadn't believed her, had written it off as adjustment difficulties. The Carters had punished her by escalating the demonstrations, careful to leave no evidence. She'd aged out at 16, too damaged to fight back. We spent hours comparing experiences, finding strength in shared survival. Mason took notes, documenting everything with the same methodical precision his parents had used against us. But where they documented pain, he documented resilience. The meeting led to an unexpected development. A local foster care advocate who'd attended the hearings approached us about starting a support group, not just for Carter survivors, but for all foster kids who'd experienced abuse. Mason and I exchanged glances. We weren't ready to be leaders, still processing our own trauma, but Amy volunteered to help organize it. She'd spent years in therapy, had done the work to heal. She could guide others through the early stages while we figured out our own paths. We agreed to attend meetings when we felt ready, but not to lead them. The Carters' business began to crumble. Word had spread through the foster care community. Their reputation, once sterling, was now toxic. Mr. Carter's business partner formally dissolved their partnership. Mrs. Carter was asked to resign from several charity boards. Their social circle, built on their image as generous foster parents, evaporated. They listed their house for sale. Mason found out through Nicholas, whose mother worked in real estate. The asking price was low, suggesting desperation. They needed to leave town, start over somewhere their history wouldn't follow. But the internet has a long memory, and their names were now linked to child abuse in searchable court records. Mason struggled with complicated emotions as his childhood home went on the market. He'd had happy memories there too, before he understood the price others paid for his parents' twisted version of education. We drove by one evening, parking across the street. The for sale sign looked small against the large house that had hidden so much pain. He sat in silence for 20 minutes, processing 16 years of life in that house. Then he started the car and drove away without looking back. Some chapters needed to close completely. The house sold within a month to a young family with 3 kids. Mason insisted on sending them an anonymous letter, warning them to check the basement carefully. He'd remembered hidden cameras his parents had installed, worried they might still be active. The new owners found them and had them removed, grateful for the warning. My GED test date arrived faster than expected. Mason drilled me on math concepts while I helped him with his college essays. We developed an efficient study partnership, each pushing the other to excel. The test itself felt anticlimactic after everything we'd survived. I finished each section early, confident in my answers. While waiting for results, I started researching colleges too. My grades from before the Carters had been excellent. Mrs. Rodriguez had been right about my potential. I just needed space to pursue it without fear. Several schools offered programs for non-traditional students, paths designed for people whose education had been interrupted. Mason received his first college acceptance letter on a Tuesday. He'd applied early decision to a pre-med program 3 states away. Full scholarship based on his exceptional test scores and compelling personal statement. He'd written about learning empathy through inability to feel physical pain, about wanting to revolutionize how medicine approaches rare neurological conditions. He stared at the acceptance letter for a full hour, tears streaming down his face. For someone who couldn't feel physical pain, emotional sensation hit him with overwhelming intensity. I sat beside him, understanding without words. This was freedom made tangible, a future entirely separate from his parents' influence. My GED results arrived the next day, passed with scores high enough to qualify for college credit in several subjects. Mason insisted on celebrating at Vic's restaurant. The old man brought out a cake he'd apparently been saving for this moment, decorated with new beginnings and careful frosting script. That night, we started planning our next moves. Mason would leave for college in 6 months. I had applications to complete, financial aid to figure out. We'd likely end up at different schools, our paths diverging after this intense shared chapter. The thought was both scary and necessary. The Carters made one final attempt to regain control. They sued Mason for defamation, claiming his testimony had destroyed their livelihood. The lawsuit was transparently vindictive, filed through a budget lawyer who specialized in desperate cases. Alexandra laughed when she read it, already preparing a motion to dismiss. The judge threw it out in preliminary hearings, citing the extensive evidence supporting Mason's claims. She went further, suggesting the Carters were fortunate not to face criminal prosecution. Their lawyer withdrew from the case immediately after, unwilling to pursue further frivolous action. We heard through Sarah that the Carters had moved to a small town 2 states away. Mr. Carter found work as an independent contractor. Mrs. Carter took a job at a local nursery. They lived quietly. Their dreams of fostering more children permanently ended. The state had flagged them in the system. They'd never have access to vulnerable children again. Mason received a final letter from his mother 2 weeks before leaving for college. This one was different. No threats, no manipulation. Just 2 pages of what seemed like genuine reflection. She admitted to losing sight of right and wrong, to convincing herself their methods were justified. She didn't ask for forgiveness, just wanted him to know she finally understood the harm they'd caused. He read it 3 times before responding with a single sentence. Understanding isn't enough, but it's a start. He sealed the envelope and mailed it, closing that door with quiet finality. My acceptance letters started arriving. 3 schools offered partial scholarships. 1 provided a full ride, contingent on maintaining grades and participating in a mentorship program for foster youth. The choice was obvious. It was only an hour from Mason's school, close enough to visit, but far enough to build independent lives. Our last month in the apartment above Vic's restaurant passed in a blur of preparation, shopping for dorm supplies, finalizing paperwork, tying up loose ends. We'd accumulated more than expected in our months of independence. Physical objects felt less important than the skills we'd developed. Cooking, budgeting, navigating bureaucracy, standing up for ourselves. Vic threw us a going-away dinner, inviting everyone who'd supported us. Alexandra came, bringing news that several policy changes were being implemented in the local foster system based on our case. More oversight, better training for recognizing abuse, mandatory reporting improvements. Change came slowly, but it came. Sarah attended, about to start her medical residency. Marcus sent a video message from his new job site, having earned a promotion to foreman. Amy brought 2 younger foster kids she'd been mentoring, showing them proof that survival was possible. The room filled with stories of resilience, each person carrying scars but refusing to be defined by them. The morning we left, Vic handed us each a wrapped package. Inside were leather journals embossed with our initials. For the next chapter, he said simply. Mason and I had trouble speaking around the lumps in our throats. This man who'd asked no questions had given us more than just shelter. He'd provided dignity when we needed it most. We loaded our cars separately, preparing for different destinations. The plan was to drive to Mason's school first, get him settled, then continue to mine. Standing in the parking lot, we struggled with goodbye. We'd been through too much together for simple words. Finally, Mason pulled out his phone and created a shared document. We'll write to each other, he decided. Real letters, not just texts. Document the good stuff now. It was perfectly him. Methodical, meaningful, forward-looking. The drive to his campus took 4 hours. I followed his car, watching him drum on the steering wheel to music I couldn't hear. On campus, we unloaded boxes into his dorm room. His roommate seemed nice. A kid from the Midwest studying engineering. Normal. Wonderfully. Blessedly normal. When time came to leave, Mason walked me to my car. We stood awkwardly. Two kids who'd been forced to grow up too fast now facing the strange privilege of normal young adult separation. He hugged me quickly, fiercely, then stepped back. Thank you, he said simply. 2 words carrying the weight of everything. For seeing his humanity when his parents couldn't. For teaching him empathy they'd never shown. For fighting beside him when escape seemed impossible. I nodded, not trusting my voice. Then I got in my car and drove toward my own future, watching him shrink in the rearview mirror. But this time, the shrinking figure wasn't a threat left behind. It was a friend moving forward on his own path. My campus was smaller, quieter. The scholarship students had early orientation, a chance to connect before the main rush. My roommate was also a former foster kid, though her story was different. Neglect rather than active abuse. We bonded over institutional coffee and shared wariness of too good to be true situations. Classes started, challenging but manageable. I chose psychology as my major, surprising no one who knew my story. Understanding human behavior had become survival skill. Now I could study it properly. My professors noted my insight into trauma responses, though they didn't know the source. Mason's first letter arrived 3 weeks into semester. 6 pages of his neat handwriting, describing classes, new friends, the strange freedom of being just another pre-med student. He joined a support group for students with chronic conditions, finding community with people who understood physical difference without needing painful demonstrations. I wrote back about my abnormal psychology class, how textbooks described things I'd lived through in clinical language, about my volunteer work with the campus foster youth program, about learning to trust good things, expecting safety instead of harm. We settled into rhythm, letters every 2 weeks, visits once a month. Sometimes Sarah joined us, sharing residency horror stories that made us grateful for undergraduate problems. Marcus sent construction photos, building something solid after years of instability. Amy updated us on the support group, now serving dozens of foster youth. The Carters faded to background noise. Occasional updates filtered through. They'd divorced, unable to maintain their partnership without shared purpose. Mr. Carter remarried quickly. Mrs. Carter lived alone, working at the nursery, tending plants that couldn't feel pain. Years passed, degrees earned, careers started, relationships built on trust rather than transaction. The scars remained but no longer defined us. We'd transformed from victims to survivors to something more. People who'd faced darkness and chosen light, who'd been broken and rebuilt ourselves stronger. Mason specialized in pediatric neurology, focusing on rare conditions. I became a therapist, specializing in foster youth trauma. Sarah ran a clinic providing free medical care to at-risk children. Marcus started a construction company that hired kids aging out of foster care. Amy directed a nonprofit supporting abuse survivors. We'd taken our pain and alchemized it into purpose. Not because trauma made us stronger, that was a lie the Carters might have told, but because we'd chosen to build something meaningful from the wreckage they'd left behind. Because surviving wasn't enough, we wanted to thrive. The last time I saw the Carters was at a conference 5 years later. Mrs. Carter was there as a vendor, selling therapeutic plants. She saw me across the room and froze. I met her eyes steadily, no longer the scared 13-year-old she'd terrorized. She looked away first, packing up her booth and leaving early. I felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, no residual fear. She'd become irrelevant to my story except as a chapter that led to better ones. The opposite of pain isn't pleasure, it's peace, and I'd finally found mine. Subscribe for more content like this. There's a lot of stories you can view on my page.